Hello and welcome again to Sport Unlocked, the podcast digesting all the week's sports news, and we're at episode 52, just about reaching our year on air. I'm Rob Harris from the Associated Press, and alongside me as ever, Tarek Pandya from the New York Times and Martyn Ziegler from the Times. And no winter training camp for us on the pod, though. Still all in England.
Some people heading off to sunnier climes, not least Newcastle United, who, surprise, surprise, are going to have a mid-season break in Saudi Arabia. You may recall that a Saudi-backed consortium took over the club in October, and the Premier League said that they approved it because they weren't going to be controlled by the Saudi state or actually owned by the Saudi state, but they're still going to the Saudi state, Tarek.
Yeah, they still are. It's hard to hold the line when you really are owned by the Saudi state, isn't it? And this is a playbook that we've seen before. We've seen this movie several times. Paris Saint-Germain, owned by the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund. Where do they go every winter? They go to Qatar. Manchester City, owned by the brother of the ruler of the United Arab Emirates, often found, guess where, in the Arab Emirates. And Saudi Arabia, definitely not owned by Saudi Arabia, but wink, wink, owned by Saudi Arabia, or off to Saudi Arabia.
Well, this is what happened when Eddie Howe was asked about going to Saudi Arabia and the human rights questions this week.
It's a football decision. You know, we're doing it for the benefit of the players, the group, in our fight to stay in the division, and that's my only thought. And the facilities and everything around the trip are going to be first class. As I said, we will train, and we will train hard, and we will train in preparation for our next game. So that's always going to be my only focus.
That's the Newcastle manager, Eddie Howe, there. Well, the one thing we might be sure of is they're listening to us in Saudi Arabia, because we did hit 22 in the Apple Sports pod charts there this week. So hello to everyone in Riyadh.
Hey, Riyadh, get your votes in for the Sport Podcast of the Year.
Yeah, and a lot of interest in our story from last week that emerged from the pod when Andy Murray's agent was talking about not going to Saudi Arabia in terms of rejecting those offers.
Yeah, I mean that
Sports Unlocked going global.
Yeah, that went around the world. That interview with Matt Gentry, wasn't it? And that was very good.
Rob, someone else who's spending a lot of time and might have even moved to the Gulf is the FIFA president Gianni Infantino. According to a report in Swiss Sunday newspaper, he has moved to Qatar. Maybe he likes a bit of warm weather training at this time of year as well.
Yeah, at least it was something FIFA acknowledged low down in a press release a few months ago, the fact he was starting to split his time there. Different from this World Cup compared to others, the fact that it is actually a joint venture between FIFA and the local organisers in terms of running it, so that gives them some cover about why he would be there. A lot of people working from home these days, working from anywhere, but he was back at Zurich this week for those FIFA Best Awards. We really have to get into some of the oddities of how they unfolded in terms of things like the Team of the Year later. But FIFA insisting he's still paying his taxes in Switzerland as well. And Havelange, when he was FIFA president, spent a lot of his time in Brazil, but it's probably the optics of him being in Qatar has sort of raised some questions.
Yeah, and also raises the questions of how FIFA works operationally now compared to how it did before, and how also its reforms after the bunch of people got arrested and sort of threatened to bring FIFA down were going to play out. According to those reforms, the president was supposed to be a kind of overarching figure, not someone who's involved in day-to-day operational business, and that should be the role of the Secretary General, the CEO. In this case, it would be Fatma Samura. Having covered previous build-ups to World Cups, the CEO then, the now disgraced FIFA former General Secretary Jerome Valcke, he was the hands-on operational guy. He was often flying off to places, to Brazil, for example, for the World Cup, before the World Cup there, and trying to knock heads together, get things going. But here, the one person you notice is not being very present at all in the day-to-day aspects of the FIFA World Cup or these conversations about the calendar is the General Secretary, Fatma Samura, and Gianni moving to Qatar to take on a more operational role sort of highlights that point to me a bit as well.
She was at the FIFA Best Awards on Monday night doing interviews on stage. Seemed to be enjoying that. The virtual FIFA Best Awards, because obviously we couldn't go there in person. They were held in the lobby of FIFA HQ.
Yeah, it's just another strange use of the general secretary of FIFA's time instead of really getting to grips with running the organisation. It seems to be a weird role. That's all I can say.
You'd have expected the show might have ended once Alexia Putellas, the Spain and Barcelona player, was handed the award, virtually at least, for Women's Player of the Year. And then we had Robert Lewandowski defending his FIFA best title as well, 2 years in the running for the Poland and Bayern Munich striker. But then, out of nowhere, up pops Cristiano Ronaldo winning a FIFA Special Award, and in person, the only player to actually, of the award winners, to be there on the stage in Zurich. So actually, he closed the show, even though he didn't make the top three, and someone who had a say on the top three was Martyn.
Yeah, I had the English media vote for my troubles. It wasn't particularly easy with one because I thought it was ridiculous that you had to like choose a player from their performances between October 2020 and August 2021. So that basically, if it had been the whole calendar year, it would have been much more straightforward, and it just means you're missing months out of every season where people, players can be doing things. But anyway, yeah.
So who was your top three?
My top three, I went for Messi, mainly because of his Copa America feats, the triumph there. Lewandowski second, and then I went Jorginho third because of having won the Euros and the Champions League. I'm sure lots of people will disagree.
Particularly in Egypt.
Yeah, so I didn't vote for Mo Salah because you're not supposed to take into account anything that has happened from August, anything this season. So obviously, if it had been this year, then Mo Salah would have been right up there in my thoughts about number one. So it's just one of those strange anomalies and something FIFA should really look at, I think.
It wasn't the only strange anomaly at those awards. I know that the award for best player and the team of the year are separate. The FIFA Pro uh, come up with the team of the year, a poll of its members, but all three of the women in the final three for women's player of the year, none of them appeared in the team of the year. That award, as Rob said, was handed to the Barcelona and Spain player Alexia Putellas, but she wasn't in the team of the year. Neither were the other two candidates. How does that happen? Rob? Do you know the mechanics of this?
Well, it's a vote by the players, so the players themselves, as members of their unions, do get the vote. But I think the more curious selection then has to be what happened in the men's FIFA Pro World 11, because we end up with this odd 3-3-4 formation with a front line of Haaland, Ronaldo, Messi, and Lewandowski there. Complaints in Egypt, there's no Salah. But they had to have picked the formation, so they could have had a more balanced defence by only having three or even two players up front and actually putting a more realistic team rather than shoehorning in all the talent they needed to up front.
Yeah, I've heard sometimes these sort of anomalies, like the one you mentioned, are to not offend some of the more high-profile superstars in world football. I haven't looked into this, but the other thing with the women's one, there were a couple of players in the women's team who have hardly played any football at all this in the calendar year. Martyn mentioned they just haven't played any football. Some were off. Some had just come back from maternity leave. So it was very strange to see the selection of these players.
Yeah, I think there was, for example, I think some of the Canada team who'd won the gold medal, for example, at the Olympics, um, should have been. There was a very good argument for some of them being in those awards, but they didn't make the cut. So yeah, it's a strange one. I mean, I think that some of the players have spoken out about this, saying that there needs to be sort of more exposure given to women's football and perhaps more research into how how can you have a situation where Canada wins the Olympics and not one of their players gets their sort of recognition. I think if that had happened with the men's team of the year or the men's award, there would have been much more of an outcry.
And also Bev Priestman as the Canadian, well, the English-born coach of Canada's winning Olympic football team as well, and she wasn't recognised in terms of the top three of the coach of the year either. So, quite a bit gone against Canada in these awards.
I think a lot of it was certainly the women's side, a bit of star power, name recognition, even among the the female footballers who had the FIFA Pro vote. It was people who are famous, a lot of players that you would have recognised from years and years ago, sort of still there, but clearly their powers have waned on the field, but still year after year named in these teams of the year.
And do awards even matter? Well, you can vote for us in the Sports Podcast Awards still at sportspodcastawards.com, and the link is on our Twitter feed as well. Pinned there, we're just at Sport Unlocked on Twitter. Well, Gianni Infantino was busy because he went from Zurich to Manchester. A bit of an unexpected trip, that. So he's not been at his home in Doha as much this week because he went to meet some leading players and the English Players Union, the PFA, to discuss the future of football and particularly player welfare. And amongst the players there were the Manchester United duo Paul Pogba and Juan Mata, and the Manchester City players Steph Houghton and Lucy Bronze. And what struck me, speaking to him on a brief call afterwards with another journalist, was he's certainly not playing up the Biennial World Cup plans anymore, and very much focusing on claiming to be listening to players about the workload, the congested calendars, and he said effectively he didn't ask them if they even were in favour or not of the Biennial World Cups, but he did reflect that there was a discussion over the diminishing of the prestige of the tournament if the frequency was doubled. But by now, if he'd had his way, Gianni Infantino might have had the Biennial World Cup plans already approved in December had the vote not been scrapped.
Yeah, I think it's just, I think we've spoken about this before, that he's been on to a loser on that one for some time. And I think this is just a sort of reflection of the fact that he's trying to accept defeat without admitting defeat, I think is the best way of putting it.
Yeah, and there's also other people on their travels this week. The UEFA president, Alexander Seferin, was in Paraguay to meet with CONMEBOL at their congress. There's some funny pictures there. They've had a bit of downtime. They visited a hydroelectric power plant on the border of Brazil and Paraguay, hard hats in tow with Zvonimir Boban. I can say it is an interesting place to visit, but it does show perhaps the deepening ties between CONMEBOL and UEFA, that this delegation from UEFA headed off to Paraguay for this meeting with CONMEBOL. And Martyn, you mentioned it. We've spoken about this on this pod before. The future looks like a deepening of the Nations League that will include South American teams, perhaps as soon as next year, and then maybe a grand final with an enlarged group of maybe up to 8 teams, a tournament in the summer of South American and European teams. And maybe they've got Gianni Infantino to thank for this. His hard push for the Biennial World Cup has made UEFA and CONMEBOL even more certain of their own plans.
Yeah, it's spot on there, Tarek. I mean, I think it's going to be quite interesting with this sort of, this friendship between the two continental organisations. When it comes to the 2030 World Cup, they're going to be bidding against each other, aren't they? So we're going to have, looks like Spain and Portugal up against the South Americans who want to have the centenary of the World Cup in Uruguay, Argentina, and a couple of other countries, because it'll be 100 years since the first one in Uruguay. So that's going to be a difficult conversation when it comes around to that voting. Although we have said before, could there even be a World Cup in Spain and Portugal and South America with maybe a group in Uruguay to sort of reflect that historic moment?
Well, that might be the way of actually getting them to work closely together. It would be a real challenge for fans in terms of some of the movements, but maybe not as challenging as this year's World Cup, the one we thought would be quite logistically simple. We did talk a few weeks ago about the limited number of hotels in Qatar for the tournament. Well, this week we had the rather understated launch of ticket sales for the tournament. Finally, you can start registering to attend the World Cup, starting from November the 17th, running through to December the 18th. But there's been quite a focus, obviously, on the cost of some tickets. We discovered that the cheapest tickets for local residents, which of course includes the migrant workers who have suffered so much, well, they will only be $11, the cheapest since Mexico 1986. But for some of the tickets, well, for the final, the highest prices have gone up 46% since Russia. So they are more than $1,600 for the most expensive, and the cheapest will be over $600 to attend the final. And now will be the real test of interest. We did get the first figures from FIFA in terms of the first 24 hours of sales, and they did say that there were 1.2 million tickets requested, including 140,000 for the final, which would be in an 80,000 seat stadium. But not unexpectedly, most requests did come from Qatar in this first tranche of requests.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in a way it sort of highlights what Qatar is like itself, with a number of very, very wealthy people, the sort of the Qataris themselves, and the majority of the population, including the very sort of poorly paid migrant workers. So, cheap seats for them, and lots of money being spent on the expensive tickets by the others. So, it's going to be I think the interesting thing here is how many people are going to come from the participating countries. I don't think it's going to be that many, actually. I mean, we saw in Russia, just talking about England. I mean, England had one of the smallest number of travelling supports it's had in World Cups for several tournaments, a long time, probably back to Mexico. And I think that's going to happen again in Qatar.
It's also the date in November is not your typical World Cup date. It's not a summer holiday like previous World Cups would have been, certainly for people in the Northern Hemisphere. November to December is not typically a time when people go on holiday. And of course, it ends shortly before Christmas as well. I wonder how much that will take its toll. But Rob, I called you the other day because I was racking my brain to remember this period during the bid. There were so many claims by Qatar during the bidding process around 2009. And I was like, God, I really remember they were saying that they were going to fly fans out themselves. They're going to put their hands in their own pockets and pay for some supporters from qualifying countries to go. That rhetoric, we is such a long time ago. We've forgotten so many of the weird and outlandish efforts to woo support during that bid. But I distinctly remember there was a call that, where, because they're so wealthy, there would have been an opportunity to put their hands in their pockets to ensure that people could come from all over the world. And now you've mentioned these $10 tickets for residents, but you've also said that this could be one of the most expensive World Cups, be it from an accommodation point of view and these ticket prices you just mentioned. Seems like now.
And even if the accommodation is regulated in terms of the pricing in Qatar, there's just very little of it. And then you've got to factor in flights in and out of the country. And there's no indication yet from any of the airlines, Qatar Airways, an official FIFA sponsor, that they're going to do much to actually help the fans in terms of base amounts, in terms of the cost, to ensure that they can get there in an affordable way. And that's probably why there's, if not masses of negativity this week around ticket sales, but even perhaps indifference from places. Because if we just take a list at the countries of interest after Qatar, well, the European nations really aren't represented significantly at all to start with. So you've got Argentina, Mexico, US, and UAE as the next countries in the list in terms of requests by numbers. Then you've got England, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and France. So only England and France from Europe featuring in the top 10 of the list of requests in the first 24 hours, which maybe they'll say this looks great because there's a lot of fans from India going to go. They're high up on the list, or from the UAE and Saudi. This is a Middle East World Cup. It's not a European World Cup. But yeah, well, I mean, something was noticeable in the fact there wasn't much fanfare around the world. They couldn't do a big PR push. Lots of Qatari officials or players from the country, or even their much vaunted ambassadors on television around the world, because of course they'd face questions about things like human rights, which shows if they can't even do a big push around ticket sales, then they're never going to be able to shake off this negativity or attempt to, or try and be positive. They know themselves they can't be positive about their tournament.
Yeah, it was a very sort of muted launch. I mean, the first we heard about it sort of dribbled out on a sort of a few tweets from the Qatar National Bank, and then there was an email just dropped. There was no sort of previous warning, no big razzmatazz around the ticket sales. It's just, they're going on sale.
Yeah, people wouldn't have known unless it was Martyn and myself doing the story the night before with some of the early details.
You must have some great sources, guys. The other point here is it seems like another tournament that people are just hoping to get through. We had the Tokyo Olympics behind closed doors because of coronavirus, and there was not much fanfare around that. in two weeks or so, we have the opening of the Beijing 22 Winter Olympics again, an event that is really surrounded with negative headlines. It will be in a so-called closed loop seal to prevent the visitors to China, the athletes and the officials, bringing coronavirus with them. And talk around China's human rights abuses has been very obvious in the last few weeks. And then we head to Qatar again, an event 10 years in the making, which has been overlaid with concerns over migrant worker rights and other human rights questions, plus how questions of corruption in terms of how Qatar won the bid and the disruption to the football calendar in order to make sure this event can take place in a safe environment and not in the searing heat of June and July when Qatar was given this World Cup. So, yep, it's sort of, this is now the stage for mega events. Seems, not this joy, not this hopefulness, just right, it's there, play the thing and get over it. And your muted ticket sales announcements might suggest that too.
And in the case of Beijing, we've already got NBC as the main US broadcaster, as well as ESPN, cutting down on the number of staff who are even going to go to China. That's over coronavirus concerns. And it's 21 days quarantine that potentially you're going to have to go into if you test positive. But underlying that as well, a more muted level of coverage obviously helps to grapple with all those human rights questions about even being on the ground in China, how much indeed you report on things like the crackdown on the Uyghurs and bring that into the conversation so it isn't seen as too triumphalist about China, or maybe the coverage of it ends up just being largely about these are the athletes performing well and it happens to be in China, and it's very few mentions really of the location because there'll be no atmosphere much anyway if there's not many fans there.
Yeah, there's also been this chilling comment this week about protests from the Chinese organisers saying that anyone who goes out of bounds, as it were, without specifying what that would mean in terms of protesting or criticising anything happening in terms of China's human rights or anything else, faces the punishment under Chinese law. Now, that is not a pleasant thought for anyone about to board a plane to Beijing. So that chilling effect is already in place.
Yeah, I was on a call with Human Rights Watch this week talking about the Beijing Olympics, and they had Noah Hoffman, the American cross-country skier, double Olympian. He was really scathing about the IOC and saying he actually felt worried for athletes who are going to Beijing who plan to make some sort of human rights protest about the Uyghurs or other human rights issues, because he actually said, this is a really concerning situation, and Human Rights Watch described it as a Orwellian surveillance state.
Yeah, Hopman saying maybe they should speak out when they get back, and there's also concerns about China spying on devices and data privacy, and you've got teams advising athletes, indeed media, about not taking your own phones and laptops and having completely separate devices when going out to China.
Yeah, this is very common among media organisations, and I think the Dutch, the US, the British, all of them have offered their athletes the use of so-called burner devices, phones or laptops, for going to China. Again, it just smacks of something completely joyless. It's like you're going for a battle rather than some sort of celebration of sport. It really shouldn't have come to this, but again, this is how the trend has been in terms of awarding hosting rights. It's been these often authoritarian regimes that have secured the major tournaments. Perhaps one reason why the IOC has changed its policy in order to almost hand the event, its blue ribbon event, to cities that aren't run by regimes like that. For example, we've got the next Olympics is in Paris, the Summer Olympics is in Paris, and then Los Angeles, and then they've given it to Brisbane. We've talked about that process lacking transparency, and I think that's fair. But God, when we look at the list of hosts that we've just discussed here, perhaps something needed to give.
Well, some companies still seen as great value in sports rights and interesting sports events around the world, because moving away from the Olympics back into Europe this week in the world of sports business, UEFA are trying to raise the interest in their commercial rights, and they're going out to tender with the search for a company to sell them, which might sound dull, but actually it's all about the big headline number in terms of what they're telling companies that bid to sell the rights can deliver on. Martyn, what did the document show?
Well, we should get a decision by UEFA on this probably by the end of the month. So there's four major sports marketing companies who are bidding for the right to sell these commercial and media rights on behalf of UEFA. From what I understand, UEFA, because this is the new look expanded Champions League, 10 group matches instead of 6, 36 teams instead of 32, they are predicting or saying UEFA is expecting to get 5 billion euros a year from this, and that's compared to 3.6 billion euros at the moment. So that's like 40% just about a rise, which is when you look on the sort of more domestic level of the clubs who don't get into the Champions League, they're going to be even further adrift in terms of finances compared to the clubs that are in the Champions League. But it's from a purely sports business thing, it's going to be an intriguing one. We've got IMG or Endeavour as they're now called, that they're in for it. Relevant Sports, the US agency, Team Marketing, who have held the rights for years, and the other one is Infront. So they're all going to put in different bids. Some are, from what I understand, are going to make minimum guarantees of what they will give UEFA, and then they'll take a share of everything above that. Some are just going on a straight commission-only basis. So, yeah, it's going to be fascinating. The only other thing to mention about this very quickly is that for the first time, it's UEFA and the European Club Association handling this tender together. It's like a joint initiative, which just shows that the clubs are now calling the shots to a much greater extent than they ever have done.
Yeah, and also to be clear, if this is for that expanded Champions League tournament, this will include a lot more matches as well. The model has changed for the tournament itself, which means there'll be dozens of more matches to sell. Hence, there'll be more games. Is that right, Martyn, or is it the current
that's
format?
absolutely right, Kurt. Yeah.
Too many games in many ways. We're going from 6 in the group stage to 10 per team, which, if you just think back to the group stage we just had in the Champions League, even 6 can seem too many at times, given how it fades off. And just imagine how it would be with 10.
Yeah, well, it's different, isn't it? It's not you're not in a group. You're all in one league, the Swiss model. So, I mean, I don't know whether it's going to tail off or if it's actually going to be more exciting. It could go either way.
Yeah, just a lot of games to keep people interested in throughout. Although, let's just hope there's nothing like we've been experiencing in the Premier League, which is so many postponements. So at the moment, we're ending up with masses of games in hand for some teams, particularly like Burnley at the bottom of the league. And, it's looking very distorted in terms of the league. And it's looked quite farcical around the world in some ways, the Premier League, and the way it's been postponing games, because we've had those cases where a single coronavirus case sees a game called off, not because of that infection, but because of other injuries and players being at the African Cup of Nations as well, and these rules being completely stretched in terms of the criteria. But now the Premier League and the clubs are starting to look at revising the rules, and particularly some of the urgency to do so has come from Christian Perslow, the Aston Villa chief executive, who you're speaking to this week, Martyn.
Yeah, he said the rules aren't fit for purpose. I think the problem was with that when they were drawn up with the sort of to deal with the pandemic, they were like a bit too vague. So we've now had 21 matches called off, plus another one for snow. In La Liga, I think there's been one, and none.
One of those 21 matches called off was postponed a second time as well. Burnley Watford.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely. Yeah, so I don't think. La Liga in Germany, there's just. I think there might only be between the two of them. There've only been one postponed game. So it's the problem has been they've allowed clubs to cite things like suspensions, international absences, injuries, non-COVID related. So you can actually have a match postponed even if you didn't have a single COVID case. So that's what I think they're going to address this. It would make much more sense if they said you can only postpone a game if you have, say, 5 COVID absentees. we've had in the past, there have been lots of occasions where clubs have struggled to get a team together. I mean, back in the day, Middlesbrough cancelled a match of their own volition, got a points deduction, and ended up getting relegated. Spurs famously had the lasagna gate when they all got food poisoning from lasagna. Said that they couldn't get a team out, but we're told with Premier League they had to play. Ended up losing the match and not quite getting into the Champions League.
Final day of the 2006 season, that when Tottenham were at West Ham, and on the day of the game they were trying to get it called off, and the players had to still fulfill the fixture while feeling particularly groggy on the pitch. And just now, that would be probably cancelled at a stroke of a pen by the Premier League. And at least they're not going through the farce that you see at times in Serie A, where Serie A makes the teams turn up even though they know the opposition has been ordered into quarantine by local health authorities. But certainly the Premier League hoping actually with Omicron and the number of coronavirus cases fading away at the moment that actually they won't need to be encountering this issue. But they're obviously alert to the fact that because the precedent has been set, that they could be dealing with a situation in a few weeks where there is 0 coronavirus cases, but just a load of injuries, for instance, that lead to a club saying, actually, haven't got enough first team regulars, so can we have this weekend off?
All right, guys, quiz question. We did one last week as well. Who was the opponent that Middlesbrough was due to play in 1996 when it failed to show up?
Was it Derby County?
Incorrect. Rob.
Oh, this is challenging because actually I was discussing this with one of our podcast listeners just in recent weeks, because one of our favoured listeners is actually a former Middlesbrough player, Jan Fjortov. And now I'm trying to remember which game it was.
Okay, I'll give you guys a clue. They're not in the Premier League anymore.
It's at Bradford Park Avenue.
Last clue, they've had an upsurge in form and they might be a surprise promotion candidate. Blackburn Rovers.
And actually, we're marking a decade of Blackburn's ownership under Venkis, the Indian chicken tycoons, aren't they? And they've actually revived things a bit there. They were really maligned at the start of their ownership, weren't they? Some odd managerial appointments, bit of a mess of things, but maybe the 1995 Premier League champions are finally on the way back up again.
Yeah, they came into a lot of stick because they knew absolutely nothing about football. So it's taken them 10 years to learn, but good luck.
Not just the Beijing Olympics that we've been talking about, having those ongoing issues with Omicron and coronavirus, but in Europe, they're looking ahead now to things like Champions League resuming as well, and how that impacts team travel, particularly with more vaccine mandates being in place across Europe in terms of entry.
Yeah, France is the toughest one on this. There doesn't seem to be any sort of room for exemptions for elite athletes that we've seen before or staying in bubbles. Not so far at the moment. So we've got a situation now, if you're not vaccinated, you can't go into a sports arena in France. So, I mean, that has affects itself for sports teams in France. It will have effects on visiting teams. Chelsea due to go to play in Lille. Real Madrid are due to play PSG in the Champions League. England rugby are due to go to play France and Paris. And of course, there's the French Open, and Djokovic, who we know is unvaccinated. Is he going to get to the French Open?
As it stands, he won't, because it's a very clear mandate in France. Every player who participates in the French Open, if it was to be played tomorrow, would have to be vaccinated. So the answer to that is no, and there is no exemption. But then you also look forward to the US Open as well. Travel to the United States of America is also very, very restricted to being vaccinated. Very rare exemptions for the unvaccinated. So Djokovic's path forward now in terms of Grand Slams is not clear at all. He looks more likely to be barred than let into the sites that host these Grand Slams.
Yeah, it'll just be Wimbledon, possibly.
Yes, interesting to see what the actual rules will be in place in England, whether or not it reflects many other countries going forward as well, with heavy restrictions for those who are not vaccinated, easing off for those who are. But I think England in particular, particularly for our global listeners, this week's news from the embattled government that by March we could have a removal of all coronavirus restrictions. So no quarantine, even if you do test positive, which is a relaxation that is basically unprecedented around the world, it seems, certainly in major nations.
Yeah, I think it's the way that people, especially who've been vaccinated, have reacted sort of mildly to the Omicron. And I think it's really, if you look at the sort of hospitalisation figures, it's only those people who are unvaccinated who are in the ICUs, the intensive care units. So that's why it's happening. And I mean, that's good for sport in a way, because it sounds like the COVID passports at football clubs are going to be removed. There's going to be a reduction in the daily testing for Premier League footballers, and sporting life looks like it's getting back to normal.
Sport is unlocking all around the world, as we talked about exactly a year ago on episode 1, and that brings an end to episode 52 of Sport Unlocked.
Yeah, a full year.
Amazing. Let's see what the coming episodes will bring. Whoever imagined would make it this far. Tarek, Martyn, been great company through the last year.
It's been terrific, guys, and we've got a really busy, interesting year to look ahead to, haven't we?
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Really appreciate it. Always, if you can hit subscribe in whatever pod platform you're listening to us on, and always rate and review us as well on there too. But for now, if you've got any feedback, you can always message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And enjoy the sports viewing in the days ahead. Goodbye for now.